everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Parmenius podcast. Today we're going to be talking with a folklorist here on campus that we're excited to talk to. This is, we're going to be talking with John Bodner, Associate Professor of Folklore and Social Cultural Studies program at Grenfell campus at Memorial University of Newfoundland. He's the co-author of COVID-19 Conspiracy Theories, QAnon, 5G, New World Order, and Other Viral Ideas. John, thanks for being on the pod today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
Cool. Good to have you. And so before we get into the book, which came out a couple years ago, I noticed you've been writing about just numerous subjects for years. So I saw from criminality all the way to comic books. Can you tell us a bit more about your work?
It seems to be scattered, and I'm also old, so I've gotten a chance to write about a bunch of things. The crime thing was really what I was working on just before the basically the pandemic started, right? So I spent 5 years working on living with in a community with illegal pot growers in British Columbia, and so I was really into that, and that's kind of the work that I've been doing most of my time. Work, marginalized communities, and the culture of work, and that's sort of what I was doing, and then became more and more interested in crime. So that's what I was doing beforehand. Comic books is just a problem I have. Like that's a hobby that turned into an article. I'm lucky enough to teach a course on graphic novels here, and I've been obsessed with comics all my life. So I had an opportunity to write something. That was just quirky. And then when the pandemic hit, as a folklorist, we're kind of trained in a bunch of things. And one of the things that we pay attention to are legends and contemporary legends. And so almost immediately, as soon as COVID hit, I saw these things, where we sort of have a sixth sense for them. A couple of colleagues of mine and friends will put out a call saying, listen, if you see anything, we have a digital archive. And would you send us anything? So I started looking around, and that was just a rabbit hole, and that's where I've been for 2.5 years, 2.75 years now. So the book came out of just dealing with the pandemic in the weird way that I did, which was to spend hours hanging out in conspiracy theory and with conspiracy theory groups and anti-lockdown groups and COVID skeptic groups. And so, I wasn't leaving my house, and I don't know why, but I was collecting for about 3.5 hours a day, and pretty much every day for a while. It got to be a bit of a problem. So that's where the book, the short story where the book came from, was just dealing with the pandemic by throwing myself into it.
And so those who haven't read it, the introduction gives kind of a conspiracy 101 as you kind of thread through. So to allow yourself to go deep into these, you mentioned like QAnon, but also we have like the kind of deep internet of 8kun and kind of the, the evolution out of the 4chan right-wing online ecosphere. So can you tell us a bit about this 101 or that you and your co-authors managed to put together for us?
Yeah, so the weird thing about the book is that there was actually 6 of us writing it, which I've been told is impossible. I didn't appreciate just how crazy it was before until people were like, that's crazy. So
you're never going to meet a single deadline with 6 authors.
No, you wouldn't, except that our lead editor and co-author was ruthless. Absolutely terrifying, and she's a friend. So oddly enough, I think we were all in this weird place. Like it was just that time of the pandemic. It was the first summer of the pandemic. Nobody could go anywhere. Nobody could do anything, and so we hit this little sweet spot where we all were just locked in our houses. And so we just wrote. I mean, that'll never happen again. I hope it does, because I think we got a book contract for a second one, but I don't know if it's going to happen again. We'll see. So, okay. So about the book, the structure of the book was that, when Wendy Welsh and I, were initially talking about the book, I'd already sort of seen these 5 main themes, that had developed in the pandemic and the conspiracy theories. And so I said to her that we should write on these themes And she was like, okay, well, that's fine. So we, through the jigs and the reels, eventually kind of gathered together a team and sort of assigned people based upon their strengths these kinds of themes. And you can see that in the layout of the book, right? And so everybody worked on their specialty, but the weird thing about the book is that it's not just a collection of essays. We all edited each other's work, and we all edited it in order to try to make it a whole, right? So that each chapter moved between things, so that one idea or two or three ideas that were picked up in chapter 1 would find a reflection in chapter 3 and be reinforced. And so the reader would move up through this as a unified voice. Now, I'd like to take credit for that, but I can't. Wendy and Dr. Ian Brody are both genius editors, and they're really the fashioners of it. They took some neat things and put them all together. So the 5, I don't know exactly how to say it, but I guess the 5 main themes are a kind of collection of the key conspiracy theories. So those are sort of fairly straightforward there, right? There's the anti-vaxxers. There's the anti-vaxxers and the larger context around it. There's the New World Order angle. We can go into all of these later. There's the 5G, which oddly enough has really faded later on in the pandemic, but was really quite alive at that time. And then, of course, there's QAnon, which latched on to the pandemic to kind of revive itself when it was flagging. So there were those ones. And then another component that we were lucky enough to get one of our co-authors on, Ashley, was sort of minority communities or racialized communities in North America and how they're experiencing the pandemic and their own particular ecology of conspiracy theories. So she really wrote about the kind of urban Black experience in the States. And that was really her responsibility. And she brought a lot, because we were meeting every sort of 3 or 4 days. And just to make sure we were all on the same page and stuff like that. And it was really great. Like I've lived in mostly places in Canada that are rural, that are largely populated by white people. And so she was a real education for me. It was really great. Because one of the things that I think that we noted in the book, but I want to explore more, is that nobody actually inhabits a conspiracy theory community. There's communities. And you have no idea what's going on in other people's bubbles. It's really quite fascinating that way. I mean, the internet has opened it up. Like you can kind of get access to like Black Twitter, and kind of get in there a little bit, but it's, you're a tourist, you're not living there, Yeah. And our historian, of course, did a lot of work on all the chapters, trying to make sure that we were kind of, really historically contextualizing this stuff. And he obviously wrote some of the work where we take a look at something like the blood libel legend, which emerges at least in the English tradition, in the early to Middle Ages, and sort of contextualizing, because the blood libel legend sort of runs right through a lot of the COVID-19 conspiracy theories. It's one of the
it's in the Canterbury Tales, for instance.
It is. Yes, it is. Yep. Yeah. And so we had, we use that as a kind of fulcrum, along with a bunch of other, the plague years, the Black Death is obviously one, but then other things like the Spanish flu, to basically say, hey, all the crazy stuff you think is going on now is new. It's really not. We seem to be just doing it all again and again, right?
So a remix.
Yeah, a remix.
So it's kind of a certain restricted set of conspiracy theories that keep recurring historically and keep being revived.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
The trick, at least from what like a folklorist would be interested in, and a historian, I think, because I've been talking to him recently. The trick is that it never, ever can look old. Mm-hmm. It always has to be novel. So the kind of artistry of the conspiracy theory is to take something that's a millennia old or 3 or 4 millennia old, and to make it sound perfectly new, right? An analogy would be something like when a stand-up comedian gets up there and it sounds spontaneous, even though you know that they've worked this joke for 2 years.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that illusion, that sleight of hand is immensely, it's one of the things that's engaging about conspiracy theories, even though they're likely going to burn our world down. But anyways,
okay. But it's incredibly interesting because, again, with this analogy with the stand-up, it's like this reworking of something that's just so classic, you know, the turn, the rule of threes, the callback. But I mean, this is like a huge, like almost archetypal understanding of conspiracy theories. And so like, this is something that's in the book as well. In the first chapter, I just have it written here. So, you know, in the reference, and just, you mind if I just this short quote. So in the reference of Donald Trump, is the perfect hero, you know, a veritable holy warrior. And then there's other archetypes you can see play out in conspiracy theories. So the dupe, accomplice, co-conspirator, deep cover source, whistleblower, etc. And so it's not as much to sit here and expound on conspiracies as just to say these kind of mechanisms that are playing are always just very interesting stories that we're kind of telling ourselves and retelling.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
It's hard sometimes to see a conspiracy theory as a narrative, unless you're used to looking at, like, you know, 6-word stories, you know, like, you know, so it's hard. I mean, some of them are long and developed narratives, but it's hard to see them as fictions. And of course, fiction just means crafting, doesn't it? I mean, that's what we're saying, right? So the older version of the word fiction, sometimes people think I'm being insulting, but what I'm really saying is that somebody is crafting this, right?
The most detailed historical account of something is going to be, to a certain extent, a fiction.
Yeah.
Right? Because for one thing, I can't write a history of World War II that includes everything in World War II. It's literally not possible, right? So the fictiveness of the narrative is constituted there by all the things I have to leave out.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the fiction in the fiction in the conspiracy theory is often what we might think of as the individual's competency with the structure of storytelling within their community. And that's where you get your archetypes, or I would, you know, or folklorists might just call them characters, or character types. That's where you get them from, because just like somebody that's telling a Mercian knows that there are certain role-based characters that you need in the story that do a job in the story to let the story be constructed and finish. The same kind of role-based characters exist in the conspiracy theory. So if you know the genre of conspiracy theory, then you've already internalized these characters that you're going to need. Now, you won't need them for every fiction. You won't need them for every story, but they're all there like a toolbox.
Sure.
They're all available to you.
Yeah.
Right.
So, for instance, something I encountered, and I know this has existed since at least the 18th century, the idea that all of the literature and monuments of ancient Rome are fake.
I didn't know that. I had never heard that before.
And there's a lady on TikTok who does a whole series of videos, and it's like, I recall this from somewhere. And I just recalled a book from the 19th century which mentioned this, and then I did some digging. It goes all the way back to the 18th century. But of course, you need somebody to do all that faking. Right? So you need somebody to write the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you're right, you need somebody to fake all those things. And it's the Spanish Inquisition, because who else?
They had that much time on their hands.
They had that much time and that much literary ability and genius.
Right. Well, I guess the nice thing about the Spanish Inquisition, they don't get enough play in conspiracy theories, but it is always,
not, but
it
they're,
is always
there.
Yeah,
they're there.
Yeah.
Right.
And it is always
the Spanish Inquisition did it.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Because you need. This is one of the. I'll forget. And you'll have to forgive me all throughout this conversation, is that I have a terrible memory for names. I'll remember the book I saw it in. You know, it's blue. It's got a funny squiggle on the cover.
Yeah.
But names are a little sketchy for me. So there's a scholar of conspiracy theory who has this great thing, which really opens up a bunch of ideas. Once I read it and started looking at a bunch of them, is the law of equivalency. So So there's a bunch of things. And you guys who have all fancy terms for epistemology can help me out here. But there's some basic operating assumptions that you got to go in with. And the law of equivalency seems to be one of them. And it's really useful because what it says, and this is following on your Spanish Inquisition, what it says is that a large event must have a large cause.
Okay.
Right. And so you think about something like everything that their example is everything that fell out after the assassination of JFK, right? All the results after JFK. Well, then those were monumental.
Sure.
And therefore the conspiracy.
Vietnam War, civil rights, sexual revolution, all of this.
All of this. All of these things that developed after that must have been started by an equally powerful force. Right. Which is why you have these complex, vast conspiracies of the Illuminati or the Spanish Inquisition.
I personally think that all of Latin literature was faked by the Masons, but you know.
Again, where do you find the time?
Where do you find the time? I don't know. But.
So and that one's kind of the law of equivalency is kind of neat too because it also follows from some of the other things that some of the characters do and some of the solutions, and we can talk about why conspiracy theories are solutions, but why some of the solutions are proposed. So for example, if the conspiracy is large and the crimes about to be committed upon you and your family and your people, right, are horrible, like absolutely horrifyingly terrible, then what you need to do to solve these problems under the law of equivalency may be and can be and must be equally as horrible. And so you're allowed to murder people, you're allowed to conduct extrajudicial violence, you're allowed to hang political leaders in the streets, you know. And so that's kind of the logic. That's one of the things that underlies the logic of conspiracy theory.
If a great crime is about to be inflicted upon me, there must be a great criminal, and that criminal is beyond ordinary moral constraint and concern. Hang Mike Pence. Mike Pence.
In some ways they become, and this only popped into my head, so somebody write it down so I don't forget it. They're pirates. And what is the old phrase about pirates? They are enemies to all peoples. Right. So they belong to no civilization. They belong to no legal code, doesn't extend out to them. They are beyond the scope of humanity. And therefore you can just murder them. Right. And in some ways, our villains in conspiracy theory is that model of the pirate. They've slipped out of all bounds. You know,
who's now Somali, by the way.
Yes.
You can find videos on YouTube. The U.S. Navy kills Somali pirates, and they're like cheering in the comments, right? Like that's who that is now.
Exactly. Or they're online and they're helping you steal, you know, your favorite movie. We're not trying to murder them necessarily, but maybe.
Okay, so Jordan, do you have another question?
Sure, we could just go organically at this point. Okay. So you had a point.
Okay. It's inevitable, John, I think, that we bring this, discussion around to politics at some point in the politics of conspiracy theories. Okay. And the question I would have, or the puzzle I would have, Mike.
We're just talking on the mic.
Okay.
Thanks.
The puzzle or the problem I would have is that if you look at something like the Freedom Convoy. Okay. And at the core of the Freedom Convoy is a group of people who have a pretty definable, clear, fascistic political ideology. Okay. And yet, if you dove into the people at the convoy itself, you would get a dog's breakfast of contradictory beefs. And, there would be 100 different conspiracy theories. Okay. So I'm trying to understand, is there a clear difference between somebody who believes the conspiracy theory and somebody who's just using it as a kind of lightning rod for an obscure set of beefs and discontents, which might be completely different from somebody else's beefs and discontents?
Right.
And is that kind of inherent to any mass movement, or?
okay, well, that'll lead up the rest of the hour.
Okay.
So, okay, I'm writing a piece right now where I'm trying to define the genre of conspiracy theory, and I won't bug you guys with the boring bits.
Okay.
But one of my contentions and arguments that I'm trying to find a way of building in a nice August day coming up is that what distinguishes conspiracy theory from its cousins of rumor and gossip and contemporary legend is that conspiracy theory is political speech.
Yeah.
All conspiracy theory is political speech. It's all a form of because,
and not in a vague, implicit way.
No.
Direct and explicit.
Yeah, because I'm a little bit of a Jamesonian. Is that it? Jameson.
Okay.
Where his famous essay about how not everything is political, like buttering your toast isn't political.
Not really political.
Right, and everybody got on his case, and everybody hated this article. But I think if everything's political, nothing is political. This is silly, right? But
there are degrees of explicitness in a political statement.
There are.
And so conspiracy theories would be at the end of more explicit.
They are because largely they posit a world in which threat is not interpersonal, it is political. It occurs at the level of the state and state institutions. It occurs at the level of the law, and it occurs at the level of the interaction between community and the state. Okay. That's the world that conspiracy theories talk about. When we're talking about rumor, I'm talking about how Bernie will constantly steal my books and you should never leave him alone in your office. That's just a rumor. I don't need to murder him because he threatens democracy. Right. I need to murder him because he steals my books. Right. But so the distinction I'm trying to make with conspiracy theories is that they are overtly political discourse. And that's partially what separates them from contemporary legend and rumor. Now, be that as may, somebody's going to hate that idea. It doesn't matter. That's where I'm going to try to take it. So then when you say something, when you ask the question, I'm like, yes, it is all political, right? Because this is political speech. So it really nicely can occupy the same territory as somebody that's like, I believe the liberal government is overstepping its bounds. I want less government. I want to elect a conservative government. Oh, and by the way, I think that Justin Trudeau is a pedophile in league with Charles Schwab of the World Economic Forum. And you're like, okay, wait a minute. Some of those things are normative politics and some of those things are not, but they're all political. They're all political speech, right? Which is partially explains why people can move around in them because they're all the same genre of speech. Like you and I have sat down and we've agreed to have a podcast. And so we've agreed on a genre. And we've agreed on a topic. And I'm not going to start telling you guys about the rash of my butt. And can any of you help me, right? Because we've agreed we're not going to do that. That violates a bunch of genre rules.
Doctors out there, please.
So we've got a bunch of people in a protest movement who have agreed on certain kinds of genres they're going to talk about. We're going to talk about politics.
So we're going to talk about an oppressive government in general, though we might have wildly contradictory ideas in particular on just how the government is oppressing us.
Which gets us a little closer to understanding how multiple expressions of political discourse and speech, some of which are antagonistic to each other, can coexist in a group as diverse as something like the Freedom Convoy and the anti-Trudeau movements. Because what we've all agreed to is a set of founding principles. And I think you've taken it too far, but at least you're agreeing with me. So this is how we can sort of see why there should be real tension in these groups, and there are. And I'll go into that later on if you care.
Because I have an interesting example I just encountered the other day. But
Good. So as long as we agree on a certain kind of territory and terrain upon which we stand, then we're all speaking in a similar genre, and we're all going to obey various genre rules. Then we can all coexist because we are a confederacy of individuals fighting the good fight. You know. So that's partially how you find yourself in Ottawa next to Les Moutes and various, far right fascists.
Yeah.
Along with moms and dads.
Moms and dads. And by the way, far right fascist groups who excommunicate each other all the time.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So you can have wellness practitioners who normally would be like we peace, love, and namaste, marching with fascists. And they don't really seem to have a problem with this.
Because they've focused their energies on a common enemy, and so they're not that interested in their individual differences from each other.
Partially, but that would suggest that people have made a calculus.
Sure.
A higher order political calculus, which you usually get, say, at the party system or just before a revolution, or when you're about to betray the revolution.
Okay.
But these folks, I don't think many of them are like proto ideological.
Okay. So it's politics, but in a very pre-reflective mode.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that a lot of commentators said, and I spent a lot of time watching the protests, and I just gave a talk on the roots of the protests in Ottawa. One of the things that people were talking about was just how naive the protesters were. Many of them, this was their first protest. Now, I've been to dozens of protests.
And I don't want to beat up on naive people, by the way.
No. Everybody has to start somewhere. I'm just sorry that they're starting with fascists.
Yeah, I know.
But everybody starts somewhere. But that this was really a new generation of protesters, and this is really the wave in Canada of the far right or right wing populism. Yeah. So these are all new people to this movement. So of course it's going to be an interesting grab bag of individuals and groups, but trying to bring this back to conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is a very sort of democratic genre, but it also begins like a lot of folklore that centers around belief, which is that people are willing to entertain narratives as long as they fall within the realm of their notion of possibility.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, everybody hears contemporary legends all the time, right? Stories that are just a little bit too good to be true, and you're like, well, it could be true, right? So it's that little space in between whether or not a thing is actually true, whether or not a thing is verifiably true, whether or not a thing is emotionally true. Right.
Anyone, by the way, who is a storyteller knows that there's a fine line between truth and fiction. Right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And we've got this little fun genre called fabulat. I don't know why you care, or anybody listening would care, but it means a lot of things and people still argue about it, but it's that moment between when you're telling an I story, an event that actually happened to you, and you start to tell it in a way that your audience wants to hear it, and it becomes fiction. You're crafting the story, right? Yeah. Or it's the moment where you take a migratory legend or a belief, something, and you pull it towards yourself, and you start to tell it as maybe it happened to me. Yeah. Right. So that middle ground between those two, and this happens all the time in conspiracy theories, where people will claim certain things happen to them. Right. I was denied care because of my beliefs, or, I was fired from my job because of my beliefs. And some people were. But a whole bunch of people that when you actually poke around, you're like, no, they were unemployed. They've been unemployed for 5 years.
Sure.
So
but there are people who deeply buy into their own constructed narratives.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and to the point where it's hard even to call them liars, because they've invested so much of themselves that it becomes an almost unquestionable truth to them, right? So, like the famous example of that is the Grail fellow. Like, he told so many stories of himself about being an indigenous person that in his mind he became one.
Yeah. And so the persecuted prophet is a kind of archetype, as you mentioned, right? It's a kind of character in these stories. And the persecuted prophet is really a place in which, you occupy a kind of character within your own narrative, but it's a fashion narrative. So it's a little bit in between these. So, people like, say, Chris Sky, who's really instrumental in the anti-vax movement in Canada. He's one of the people that encouraged folks to, he spread the idea that the hospitals were in on the hoax of COVID, and so he encouraged people to actually protest at hospitals as well as to break in or sneak into them to document the fact that there were no patients in the hospitals and to expose the hoax. So he often portrays himself as a persecuted hero, as do the kind of what is it
He
called?
speaks truth to power, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
And
we're all supposed to do.
that's right.
Yeah.
So that's where these stories kind of bleed into is this a narrative that we're fashioning that we want to talk about, or is this an I statement? And don't even get me started on the weirdness of these kinds of online newspapers, these online news gathering sites, which purport to have journalists exposing real things, right? Real things that then get fed into this ecosystem, this right-wing populist ecosystem. Well, these journalists are now supposedly reporting on the truth. So we have a parallel here between a narrator saying this happened to me, but it didn't really, right? To a reporter saying, through my research, I have found out these facts, but they're not facts.
Sure.
So,
Sorry, Jordan, you have another?
Yeah. Well, just at the risk of amplification, another concern in the conspiracy 101 camp, or whatever you want to call it. What are some of these websites?
I could.
For our right-wing audience.
Yeah. How about I send you a list and you can amend it at the in the metadata, because I don't recall them right off the top of my head. But many of them are coming out of. One of them obviously is the granddaddy of them all is like Rebel News, right?
Yes.
Rebel Media, right?
Yeah.
And they sort of had the field to themselves for quite a while. Ezra Levant's baby, and is now from a bunch of research that's been going on, really kind of a dark money InfoWars kind of campaign against political enemies, and it has been for years. But a bunch of people saw that there was money to be made in this area, so there's a number of different sort of fake online Canadian news sites that are popping up more and more, and I'll send you guys a list of a few of them that I've been taking a look at.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to ask for some.
But Rebel News has always occupied a very kind of carefully balanced. They've always kept a kind of careful balance between making things up whole cloth and reporting things that actually happened with significant spin, and of course that's part of the the well-known strategy of liars to always include enough of the truth that you're believable.
No, I think we should make a distinction about Rebel. You're right. Rebel News is much more about spinning and recontextualizing events. That is true. They haven't in the past made things up whole cloth, but they certainly have been surrounded by, and there's been a revolving door of people who are basically dirty tricksters who have been instrumental in trying to amplify such things as, say, the corpus of Justin Trudeau conspiracy theories. So
which I've encountered some doozies.
Oh, there's some great ones. Yeah. His crimes are legion.
Include being a Muslim, by the way.
As well as the love child between his mother Margaret and Fidel Castro. Secret communist and not white, so you get a 3 for there. You get to call his mother a sportive lady. You get to call him not white, which is a horrible thing for a bunch of right-wing neo-Nazis. And you get to call him a communist.
Sure.
So,
and the interesting thing about that, I find, is that Justin Trudeau is just the most blandest milquetoast representative of the Canadian establishment.
Yes. Yeah. But he has good hair. Yeah.
Yet he is the central figure in this kind of, demonic narrative, right? Where this guy who actually seems so bland and ordinary is actually, involved in, demonic levels of evil and calculation.
Yeah.
At the same time as he's very stupid. Right. He's really, really stupid, yet he is this cunning demonic calculator. Yeah. He is a godless communist, yet he is also a Muslim fundamentalist.
Right.
But I think it comes down to that he doesn't model a certain kind of masculinity.
Yeah.
Yeah. His hair is a little too nice, and he's a drama teacher.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's like two things there that you're dead right on. So the first one is what folklorist Jeannie Thomas is been doing a bunch of work on this. And she said, like, if you look at conspiracy theories, what you're going to find is that most of them are structured around a star villain.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, and we all know who they are. They're like Bill Gates, you know, Soros, you know, Schwab, you know, Tom Hanks early on. Still,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Oprah Winfrey.
He hates babies, does he?
He does. He does horrible things to babies. Yeah. So you've got, so every villain in a conspiracy theory has to be a star, right? They've got to be somebody that everybody can go, I know that person, which is part of one of the reasons.
It can't be the Aga Khan or somebody I don't.
No, not really. You know, no, that's a little too obscure. That's not going to be, and so making your villain a star villain allows you to cluster a bunch of narratives around one person that everybody knows. So that's handy in your storytelling, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that you pointed out is that when you put all the stories together, they're contradictory. Yeah. And so that's probably one of the things in the introduction that is really Ian Brody's contribution, one of the key contributions in the book. Well, he wrote the last chapter, which is brilliant, but in the introduction and in my own thinking is he talked about the idea that certain knowledge communities want unity, especially academic or elite knowledge communities, right? Yeah. You know, we want to start at certain principles that are fundamental and foundational, that have stood up to inquiry, and then we're going to build things around them, and we're going to get to a conclusion, and it's all nice. And
it's going to have a certain kind of unity or symmetry or
like almost like an old Christian notion of God.
Sure.
Right. A great a perfect unity of the being, right? Yeah. And that's how you know he's God. Yeah. Because there's nothing outside or extraneous or needed.
But the conspiracy theorists don't care about that.
No, because the conspiracy theories are based upon an emotional unity.
Yeah. So So Justin is both comically stupid and has malign intelligence.
Yes.
Yeah. And I don't care that that's a contradiction.
No, because it's not a contradiction because I hate him.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So and we all remember middle school, right? Or even high school, or sometimes the people we work with, where if you hate somebody, you will believe almost anything about them.
Just give me. People are just looking for something.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. It's like, and I heard they don't like cats. Always a monster, right? Also eats babies. Well, I thought that too, right? Yeah. So the emotional core of the villain
is consistent,
but
not the external details.
Because why would it have to be?
Why would it have to be?
Yeah. And the funny thing is that this obviously goes against. It's one of the reasons why it's folk. Yeah. Because it goes against the rules of something like literature, you know, modern.
Well, I mean, there are works of literature that do contain deep ambiguities and contradictions and are better for them, but usually an author tries to smooth things.
Yeah, I mean, ignore the postmodernists and their ilk, right? Yeah. But you know, modernist fiction, and it even betrays a little bit the notion of a psychological wholeness. So it betrays normative psychology as well. Which is why I really think that, you know, it's folk.
Sure.
Because we're constructing things based upon a set of principles that don't have to conform to elite norms of academia in all of its different permutations. We got our stories. They work for us.
Yeah. You know? Because their tonality is consistent, even if the narrative details jar in the most bizarre fashion.
Yes. Yeah. And the other thing, too, is that people don't tend to get upset by conflicting narrative, at least online, because of a number of processes and dynamics that happen. The first thing is that the community will generally self-correct.
Okay.
So unlike these books that we're surrounded by, obviously orality or even the quick movement of online, which replicates in many ways orality, the community will eventually edit.
Sure.
In a way that will reconcile contradictions.
Exactly like a redactor of the Hebrew Bible, say.
Oh, I do not know this.
Well, there's, you pick up, the Tanakh over there, and there's the story of Noah, and in one verse it says Noah took 2 of every animal, in another verse he said he took 7 of every clean animal.
Right.
So somebody who's putting together that story, a putative redactor, is frequently going to add a little detail or something that sort of bridges the gap. Right. He's not going to resolve the contradiction totally, because I don't think readers necessarily want that. But he's going to do a little dance or something that, right. And like that's just orality and narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
and like if it's Hebrew Bible or Homer or whatever, it applies to ancient literature that originally comes from an oral source.
Yeah. And the problem is that somebody wrote that down too soon.
Sure.
We hadn't resolved the contradictions yet, right?
Yeah, sure.
Of
course.
And so these conspiracy communities will often resolve these, and they'll come up with a set of narratives that are repeated and repeatable over time, and they work for the community. And then other people will throw new narratives in, and they'll need to be resolved. Not in a great resolution. There'll still be conflict and stuff, and there'll still be, I mean, this is the thing about folklore, obviously, is that there's never a story. There's only versions and variations. That's all there is. Sure. And so a community that shares narrative in this way becomes comfortable with versions and variations. Right? Same as in a folk song before, standard recording.
Or a folk tale.
So, you sing it and it doesn't have this verse, doesn't mean you're horrible at doing it. That's your version, right? Mm-hmm. You sing with 3 or 4 other verses, people are like, oh, that's pretty good. Yeah, okay. I didn't like the last one though. It doesn't make any sense. Don't do that again, right? Okay. So the audience editor edits, the composer's edits, and then there's this, you don't want to know, I hate organic metaphors because folklore gets blamed for this a lot. Okay. But anyways, you just add time to this process, and what you get is a partial resolution or expulsion of narratives that don't work for the community.
Yeah.
So right now, so long as Justin Trudeau stays the arch villain, and everybody's just interested in how much more horrible he can be, then all these things will come in, right? If it's sometime we need to pick a couple of narratives that we need to get behind, then there'll be a great sorting. Yeah. But if we don't have to, then why would you, right? He's horrible, you know.
Then for a while he can be the son of Fidel Castro or a close friend of Osama bin Laden. Until you have to choose.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm not too sure what the kind of inflection point would be in which you have to choose.
Yeah.
But that would be this kind of strange. No, I'm in a bit of a loss.
Well, okay. One of the things traditionally would be like when you write a story down.
Right.
You and there's 5,000 versions of what Achilles did in his fight with Hector. And if you're writing it down, you have to choose one of them. Or you could choose a couple and paper over the cracks a little bit, but you can't choose too many.
Right.
So one of those points, I assume, would be when an oral narrative becomes a written narrative.
The other, I did think of another one to buttress what you just said, which is that there's always stars. There's always, sometimes they're moral entrepreneurs. Sometimes they're what people are calling conspiracy entrepreneurs. Yeah. And these are people who have become leaders of certain movements. Again, like Chris Guy, some of the Pat King and some of the leaders of the Freedom Convoy, and these people, because of their authority in their social authority in the groups that they have, that when they pick certain narratives, they'll tend to have more authority in the groups. Okay. Not absolute, because these groups are slightly anarchic, but their version is the one that is more likely to survive, partially because somebody like me is more likely to collect it than Bill's version that I collected at 3:00 in the morning on a Facebook page, And now Bill's version is no less useful than, what's her name? The leader of the convoy.
Tamara
Lich. No more important than hers, but hers is the one that's likely to survive. So social authority will get you so far.
Right. So there'll be a process of canonization by which Tamara Lich, because she's a political prisoner and a hero, and Justin Trudeau personally intervened to have her charged, et cetera, et cetera. That makes her version of the conspiracy somewhat more authoritative, and potentially it can be canonized.
Yeah. So we get. So obviously, as most people don't understand, the forces of narrative are this interplay between the kind of structural and internal logic of the narrative itself, and then the social context around it. And those things are always interacting with each other, And so, so you're going to get these kinds of, you can also get stars who are just really good at conspiracy theory. They're articulate, they're charismatic, they're just really good at them. Because the neat thing about the Facebook crowd that I spend a lot of time on is that you can have inept performers. And that's because you're actually at you're at the birth of narrative where people are working it out, And so, so when you talk to them or type at them, you quickly realize that they don't really have the chops. But when you run into a real enthusiast, like a real,
Alex Jones early on, was a really skillful, articulate weaver of lies. But he's become an utter joke now. But I can remember watching him around 2010. He was really good at it.
Yeah. Have you guys seen Waking Life?
No.
So it's like this great Richard Linklater movie.
Where, I have seen that. Yes.
Yeah. There's just a series of very philosophical, just random, it's an amalgamation of all these kind of. He had just a philosopher come in and discuss something. And then he had a rotoscope, so someone just painted over. There's this great scene, Alex Jones is in there.
Oh.
And it's a 2001 just animated film, but Alex Jones was in his full Alex Jones, right? And it was actually so profound. And I was like, 10 years old? I was like, wow, this guy's so smart and amazing.
Yeah.
Right. But just to the point of this obvious, it's like an oration. It's like an obvious skill. Now, I'm not a folklorist like yourself, but there's that component of passion that's just, it's so unbridled. And I actually wanted to ask you about that. So, but please.
No, go ahead.
If you'd like.
Yeah, I think the thing too about Alex Jones is because these conspiracy theories masquerade as nonfiction, right? That's obviously the key to them, right?
Yeah.
We're exposing the truth of the world. We're not making stories, So I've insulted them.
A ghost story, by the way, always starts with the profession that it's a true story.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Because
even though it's not, and the audience knows it's not, and the teller knows it's not.
Now we're getting into a knife fight. Well, I'm going to leave that alone for a minute. Okay, so the beauty of Alex Jones is that it was his dexterity. He could move and shift. He had all the names and dates and data right at his fingertips. He was a great, not just debater, but he could really pull all this material together. And that's, I think, what's persuasive about him. Because you're like, it's like a great, like a great academic, somebody that seems to have everything just at their fingertips, and they just articulate and they lay it all out for you. And you're like, wow, I'm going to follow you into hell. This is going to be great.
And he lost that ability at some point.
Well, we all do. We all get old, But he did because but that's part of the but now he's got a new performance, which is just shouty rage man, and that's a different performance mode, and it seems to be working for him, right? So so sorry, I've lost track of your question. Which was
funny. Yeah, no, it's interesting because we've talked about untethered, and I'm just looking at my notes here for the listeners. So it's unfair that I have the notes and you guys have to be the academics with everything at your fingertips. But it's unfair. But I did want to ask you about this because to me the most interesting thing about conspiracies is the fact that it draws upon a certain unaccepted, untethered imagination. So we all should be a more imaginative people. We're all kind of imaginative. I've read some of your writings. I write, you write. So we all imagine, we think, but there's this need to connect that imagination to this kind of obscure creation, which is the political figures are out to get us. And then there's the complete release of the imagination. Like people I know who are into conspiracy theories, they're completely willing for it just to be this interesting thing we talk about. Not any kind of epistemological responsibility.
Right.
But actually is quite compelling. It's like, oh, interesting. Why do you even care about this?
Well, I guess that's part of the anger, I think, in right-wing populism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's partially based upon the idea that certain kinds of people get to make up the stories and the structures that I have to live under.
Mm-hmm.
Certain kinds of people get to be creative.
Yeah.
And their creations have authority and are listened to, and they form policy and things.
And they're not entirely wrong in that perception.
They are not.
No.
In fact, most of them are better critical thinkers than some of my undergrads.
Sure.
Sure. And so what conspiracy theory gives everybody, because it is a democratic activity, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, people are just like, do your own research. And you're like, there's no, study for 15 years, get your PhD, and then you can do some research that people care about. No, it's like, do it now. Just, you're sitting at a computer, do your own research.
Because, well, for one thing, you have to, if you want to be that academic who does the 15 years of work on this subject and be the expert, that either involves you taking on significant financial debt, or it involves you coming from a privileged background.
Yeah.
So in other words, expertise is a kind of privilege that's not available to a lot of people.
Exactly.
But still people who need to try and understand and make decisions about the world they're in.
Exactly. So you get this dynamic where people can be creative. Like you said, the imagination and the creativity.
Yeah.
And I would tend to think of it as that nexus between imagination and creativity, right? Because you've got to be able to imagine the world not thus, like you've got to be able to do that kind of thing. And then you've got to be creative enough to take what is actually quite large reams of data and then to try to use them to explain the world. Yeah. It is creative.
Yeah. And by the way, if you're an effective conspiracy theorist, you're not stupid.
No.
Like you have obviously a certain kind of cunning or a certain kind of intelligence that allows you to do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it's not easy work.
It's not easy.
And the other thing, I think that one of the things following on from what you were asking about, one of the persuasive things and one of the things that I think keeps people in conspiracy is the joy of creating. Right?
Of course.
Like you get to be curious. And your curiosity brings you certain kinds of explanations. Your labor brings you a product. But the cool thing too is that your labor not only brings you a product, but your labor brings you a community of people that appreciate the product that you did. And the elites didn't, and nobody else will listen to you. And maybe your children won't invite you to Thanksgiving anymore because you kind of rant a lot.
But elite resistance to your narrative is an authenticating mark of your narrative for the conspiracies. I must have hit a nerve. If the elites are not receiving my narrative well, I must have hit a nerve.
Yeah. And so we get these kinds of dual, it is dual. I mean, because conspiracy theories are a Manichean system, right? They're a light and dark system. Yeah. So you get that thing that I was just describing, which is that your internal group and your internal laboring processes reinforce all of the in-group best feelings, felt feelings, solidarity, camaraderie, noble aspirations, all of these things in the in-group. And then as Bernie pointed out, the rejection and criticism and aggression of the out-group elites and everything just reinforce the truth claims that you and everybody are making. And it's a beautiful system, which is not confined to conspiracy theorists, right?
No, that's true.
It's a beautiful, simple sociological system which underpins most of human history.
Sure.
But it's also a perfect recipe for increasing radicalization and going further and further down the rabbit hole.
Because the problem with all this wonderful creativity is that, well, the more Manichean your tale becomes, the more you have either implicitly or explicitly legitimated some kind of violence against some identifiable individual or some identifiable group of people.
Yeah. And that's the end. That's the end part of my thesis on, conspiracy theory as political discourse.
So someone murders Trudeau.
Yes.
Because, of course, if he's a baby-eating demon, wouldn't you murder him?
Well, if you could go back in time and kill Hitler, wouldn't you kill Hitler?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. we're just doing it in real time now, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, this is what, you know, and you know, it's kind of like, oh, well, who would do that? I mean, Corey Huron, sorry, I always get his last name wrong. Corey Huron, drove from Manitoba and drove his truck into the gates of Rideau Hall, and stalked the grounds of Rideau Hall, armed to the teeth.
Sure.
Because he needed to save us all from Trudeau, right? So folklorists call this ostension. I'm not too sure what other people call it, but it's the acting out of a narrative.
Yeah.
And the conspiracy theory is pragmatic. It tells you who the enemy is. It tells you what problems they're causing. It tells you what the solution is. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is
that
it
legitimates the solution if the solution goes beyond ordinary moral and legal constraints.
Yes, an important point.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing that there's an argument in folklore crowd about whether or not the conspiracy theory tells you to do things. Some scholars that I respect and know say no, it doesn't. It intimates, it points. So you'll often get like, somebody should do something. We've got to act. We've got to do things, but it doesn't tell you what to do. Nobody's like, shoot Trudeau in the head.
Yeah.
But what you actually find is that if you look at the formation of conspiracy theories as active performances online, well, the chorus, the replies, they fill in the credo. They do the work and they say what needs to happen. And they say things like, lock her up in the case of Hillary Clinton, or
when Trump says go to the Capitol, he doesn't say what to do there.
No,
he's careful not to say what to do there. But
so the conspiracy theory text leads you to a certain point, but because the conspiracy theory is like a rumor or a contemporary legend, it is a dialogic genre. Which is different than other genres. Other genres are shut up and listen to me and go home when I'm done talking. These are dialogic genres. So when you're done your tale, the genre demands conversation, just like a ghost story. Could that have happened? I don't know. You know, well, are you sure it was dark out? Are you sure you saw what you saw? The same thing happens with conspiracy theory, except people debate about what the solutions are. And and that's not different than the narrative. Sorry, that's not separate from the narrative. That is the narrative. And so in the comments is when people are directed to do things. And the comments are the narrative. So that's how you get people then acting on black and white, good and evil, insider and outsider, classic scapegoat theory, and eventually somebody gets murdered or beaten up or menaced. You know, and that's why I loved conspiracy theories when I was younger. I really, really did. Like you were saying.
We all like the X-Files, right?
We all like the X-Files. Now they have so much to answer for. And I tell this story a lot, but like I had a friend whose father was clearly into conspiracy. He had one of the most beautiful book collections I'd ever seen. And at that time, I lived in the middle of nowhere. My family were obviously literate, but they didn't read very much, you know.
Sure.
But we had like 15 books in the house. 7 of them were on hockey, you know. And I love them. But this was the first place where I saw somebody with a wall of books. The first sort of family when I go over there. And now looking back on them, most of them were conspiracy theory. Right. It was like Hitler's alive. There's a face on Mars. The canal's on Mars. Tons of things about
probably a Bigfoot book in there.
Probably. I wish I could recall now all of them. And just as you pointed out before, like they're delightful. You know, there's something energizing about them. Like there's something other than just my big dumb parents and a future of work and dying in front of me. There's secrets. There's secrets to be uncovered. You know, I mean, what's better than a world in which there are secrets, you know?
So do you want to?
That's just such an interesting point.
Sorry, I'm just asking you, do you have another question, Jordan? Or?
Oh, you know, I really appreciate the dialogue, guys. And that question of the imagination has to be there, but tempered with a kind of moral responsibility.
No, I know. But I had a couple things to add.
Okay. But just a minute, I don't want to leave Jordan's moral responsibility.
Okay.
That's
a whole other podcast right there.
That is, the
what is the moral obligation of a storyteller?
or the moral of
Yeah.
because you'd think that imagination would be decoupled from a moral responsibility,
but
at some point, yeah,
in this playing out that we discussed.
But anyway, I had a kind of observation or question about the fragmentation of the conspiracy world, because I just happened to notice there was a Southern Poverty Law Center story the other day. It was some neo-Confederate organization split off from the National Front for an interesting reason. Because what the uncomfortable thing that the right-wing, the far right in America has brought together are Christo-fascists and traditional Norse Aryan pagan fascists. Right? So there's the Thor people and the Wotan people and the Jesus people. And you would think that, and they have common enemies, right? They're the same enemies. Right. The liberal Democrats and the progressives and the gender stuff and the rainbow, that's all their enemy.
Right.
And the Jesus and the Thor people both agree.
Right.
That's who the enemy is, right? They both agree on political secession of the South and all these things, right? But Jesus ain't Thor, right? And is there some necessity, and maybe this is a hopeful point, of these kinds of groups, and movements just ultimately falling apart and fragmenting from their own inherent contradictions? You can't get the Jesus and the Thor people together on this.
Right. Because a mutual hatred, so the assumption is a mutual hatred can only carry a movement so far.
Yeah.
Is there? Yes, sort of. So in the Canadian context, there is definitely a fracturing in the freedom movement that happened almost immediately upon them discovering that they could make massive amounts of money. So a number of people jumped in, or a number of people that were already in tried to secure their own positions as the voice of the movement, as key speakers, as getting the most followers on YouTube they could. And so there's been a kind of internecine warfare amongst a fairly small group of people that have been documented by journalists and online activists.
Because this is a thing frequently observed about, say, religious sects. They split up into smaller and smaller ones.
Yeah. So there's definitely that possibility that the economics of conspiracy can certainly drain and can certainly fracture any group. The problem is that there might be enough money for everybody, and that would be a problem.
Yeah.
Right. So then all of a sudden we've got, oh, well, what are we supposed to do with this? Because the weird thing is that conspiracy pays now.
Yeah.
And it pays in a way that it never did before. The effort to get into paying to making money off of conspiracy is, the bar is so much lower than it ever was before.
Sure.
Like even Alex Jones' early days when he was on the radio, right? He had to hawk his wares. He had to have material objects that he sold. He had to go to conventions and drive there and get paid like $250 to
now
speak.
All he's got to do is put in a call to the Koch brothers.
Well, that helps.
Yeah.
But the other thing that all you have to do is monetize YouTube.
Yeah. So
And
there
the money
might be
just
enough
rolls
money
in.
out there for both the Christo-fascists and the traditional
There-
Aryan neo-pagans.
Probably, yeah.
And the Kochs might just fund both.
They might just fund both. Yeah. So the other thing is that your question is kind of like a political science question, really, and I'm not there yet in trying to figure it out. I don't really know the literature on how movements fracture. How long can they be sustained? I have been reading quite a lot about right-wing populism's success in certain places, like say Hungary, Turkey, Poland. As well as some Latin American countries. And what they're saying is that some of these movements will be and can be essentially ground down. Just like leftist movements in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s in the West, right? Okay. Just simply ground down by relentless competition with people with more money. The place where right-wing populism succeeds, as most extremist movements do, and this is a bunch of folks have written about this, is when it gets adopted by a credible political party. Or somebody with real political capital who can then use that capital or is close to using the mechanisms of the state. So once right-wing populism or far-right populism gets a foothold into the mechanisms of the state, that's when liftoff happens.
Okay. And so then you get Orban, or you get the fellow in Turkey,
Erdogan.
Yeah. And we would reach that point in Canada either where the PPC achieved significant electoral success, or force the Conservative Party to move much farther to the right to fend off that threat.
Well, I mean, 12 members of the Conservative Party, a couple to their credit, they were unnamed, left, but were invited to and attended a speech by one of the organizers of the Freedom Convoy. And a right-wing conspiracy theorist who's been linked to some pretty nefarious stuff.
And by the way, after
Polyev.
After 15 years of a liberal government, like a government has a natural life cycle, who's going to replace the liberals in power? And if the public is in a mood to throw the bum Trudeau out, they're not. A lot of them, I suspect, I fear, are not going to be that nice about whether the candidate they're voting for is a fascist or not.
Well, again, this is political science and outside.
I hope they would, but sure.
Well, you would think that people wouldn't want to hang out with Nazis.
But if it's the Liberal Party that have been in power forever versus the Nazis, if the public thinks it's time to throw the bum out, are they going to,
And the truth is, we're calling these people Nazis, and only some of them are Nazis. Right? Many of them are our neighbors. There was 300 of them at a rally down here. In support.
This is another question. Because of course a fascist movement or a Nazi movement is going to depend on all kinds of fellow travelers and hangers-on who are not real Nazis themselves.
Right.
But I'm tired of Trudeau. Trudeau's been prime minister for 15 years. We need somebody else. Oh, him.
Yeah. So then we get, this kind of thing where conspiracy is always here. It's kind of a background radiation. So we've always got conspiracy. I think the key difference from a historic perspective is when conspiracy moves from the margin to the center. Right? So there's been times well documented in the American conspiracy literature tradition in which conspiracy has informed the federal government and its activities. And then other times, for example, the great defeat of the John Birch Society in the 1950s and the rise of the contemporary Republican Party, in which it's been pushed to the margins. And they were like, no, we're not dealing with you. And now conspiracy is back to the center. So I don't know if we're going to get the great coalescing between conspiracy moving into the center and somebody picking it up and bringing it into government. Those are my nightmares. Those are what keep me up at night. So
it only takes 35% of the vote to become prime minister in this country. Trudeau won the last election, 35, 36 or something. Only takes a few percentage points to shift, right? And if that shift comes from a bunch of people who, well, I don't care who's prime minister so long as it's not him, you will get a Polyev or perhaps an even more extreme figure.
Yes, you will.
Yeah, so I think that's going to happen in this country eventually.
Those are my nightmares.
Yep.
Nightmares, folks.
Yeah.
Well, guys,
unless the NDP really picks up and sucks, but sorry.
I was just going to say we're past an hour.
Jordan, you conclude?
Yes, we should probably conclude. I've got to go run some more errands.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, guys, this has been a great discussion, and just I love to be the one advocating for the imagination here. But thanks for tempering and bringing it down into the scholarship and the kind of actual responsibility that's needed for this. So did you guys want to say anything in closing?
I'd just like to thank you guys for an hour chat. That was great fun.
Okay.
And look forward to chatting more about it.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, John and Bernie. Thanks so much.
Yep. Okay.